Welcome to Rainmakers. I'm Lee Pacchia. We're joined today by John Dellaportas from Duane Morris. John recently represented Bruce Bent and his son Bruce Bent II against charges brought by the SEC that they defrauded investors during the financial crisis. Both the father and son ran the $62 billion Resrv primary fund. It was the very first money market mutual fund and the only money market fund that broke the buck or posted a net asset value of less than $1 during the 2008 financial crisis. Both the father and son were cleared of charges of fraud, but the jury found for the SEC against the son for one count, one lesser charge involving misrepresenting the fund's financial vulnerability. We're happy to have him with us. John, thanks so much for stopping by today.
Thank you.
So this was a rather huge case that flew somewhat under the radar. Your client's fund collapsed right around the time Lehman Brothers failed and filed for bankruptcy. Tell us, what was this case precisely about?
Well, this case involved a series of regulatory failings by the government, which precipitated the 2008 financial collapse. And my client, in reliance upon the government and the rating agencies, invested a modest 1% of its money market fund in high commercial paper issued by Lehman Brothers, which had the highest ratings by Moody's and S&P. And unfortunately, Lehman filed for bankruptcy, and that was enough to cause the fund ultimately to break the buck.
Could you flesh out the cause and effect a little bit for us, for people who aren't quite sure as to how this part of the financial industry works?
Sure. So a money market fund, although people think of it as akin to a savings account, is actually an investment. It's an uninsured investment whereby someone purchases shares in the money market fund at $1 a share. And the expectation in the history of the fund is that someone will get back a rate of interest, and but at a minimum, they will get back their principal. Mm-hmm. And so this was an instance where, because the fund was invested about 1% in Lehman, and because Lehman filed for bankruptcy, fund shareholders ultimately received a little over 99 cents on the dollar back.
What does this case ultimately say about the SEC here and its failure to prosecute anyone directly for the Lehman collapse?
Well, it's a very good question. I know that, like a lot of people, I've read the examiner's report issued by the court-appointed examiner of the Lehman bankruptcy. And the examiner, Mr. Valukas, found all manner of wrongdoing on the part of Lehman. And for whatever reason, the SEC has never brought any charges against anyone responsible for Lehman. And so one of the I think, galling parts of this case is that my clients were victims. They were innocent victims who had invested in Lehman in reliance upon the SEC doing its job. And not only they didn't get a letter of apology for it, but instead they got this lawsuit and they got falsely accused of fraud. And so we're very happy that the jury saw through with it and found for my clients on all the fraud counts.
And of course, you were not the original trial counsel in this case, were you?
There was predecessor counsel about 2 years ago. Our firm was substituted in for that predecessor firm, and we handled it from fall of 2010 through the present, including the trial last month.
Now, you were replacing a lawyer, of course, from Duane LeBoeuf, the firm that failed a couple months back. Why was the decision made not to continue with the lawyer from Dewey?
That you'll have to ask my client. I know that it had nothing to do with the subsequent problems at Dewey. Those postdated those by about half a year. Mm-hmm. So it was just it was a client decision that they made. They needed to make a change, and we were happy to step in. We had some involvement with the same client on related matters.
This must have been a fascinating case to work on. At any point, did you make an attempt to settle with the government before going to trial?
There were attempts both by predecessor counsel and by us to settle. The specifics of those discussions, I think, remain confidential, but there were substantial efforts on our part to settle, but there was no meeting of the minds, unfortunately.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm. And of course, Hurricane Sandy struck right as closing arguments were set to begin. How did that affect things?
Well, it presented a challenge for both sides, I'd say, because we were the trial was already 3 weeks long at that point, and then the closing arguments were delayed by an additional 9 days. And so part of the challenge in closing arguments was to make sure to refresh the jury's recollection about testimony they had heard by that point upwards of a month earlier.
So we have the verdict, and of course, both father and son were found not guilty on almost all the charges except for the negligence claim. Does that change the advice that lawyers should give clients who are money market funds when they're approaching the point where they're going to break the buck? Does this verdict change the way that they're going to operate, change the kind of advice that they might give their client?
I don't
Is there
know.
anything they should have done differently in retrospect?
I don't believe that my clients could have done anything differently. I think they were basically swept up in the 2008 financial crisis, which was completely unforeseeable. And so in retrospect, if they had had a crystal ball and would have known that the events of September 2008 were unlike anything that had happened before, then they obviously would have done things a little bit differently. But nobody foresaw it, most particularly not the SEC, which I think is one of the lessons that the jury took to heart.
Mm-hmm. And in terms of, I mean, you've had such an interesting perspective on the industry that your clients were operating in. What's next for your clients?
Well, there are some related legal matters which we have to work through. My clients are out of the fund business at this point. They've been out for a couple years, and so I think it's new challenges ahead. You know, Mr. Bent was the inventor of the money market fund and a brilliant man, and I'm sure he's going to have a lot to contribute going forward, as will his son, Bruce, too.
So we're 4 years after Lehman melted down. Do you think money market funds are still vulnerable to a kind of run on the bank scenario like your clients experienced?
It's possible, but I think the root problem wasn't anything implicit in the money market fund business. I think the root problem was that Lehman Brothers, which was AAA rated paper, collapsed. And it collapsed and filed for bankruptcy with its paper still having the highest ratings by Moody's and S&P, and still supposedly having its financials, which showed the company doing quite well, being blessed by the SEC. So the failures were not failures of the money market fund industry in general or my client in specific. They were very specific regulatory failures by the SEC not to foresee Lehman, and by the rating agencies to continue to give Lehman's paper the highest ratings at a time when obviously Lehman was, I don't know, cooking the books.
Right. There's a pronounced split at the SEC over the way forward here with money market funds, whether they should be regulated more or not. I think it's almost evenly divided amongst the commissioners of the regulatory body. In your opinion, what is the way forward? What should be done, just as an observer and a participant in our financial system?
Sure, and I don't know that this trial has any lessons for the debate about the proposed money market reforms, because I believe it was something extrinsic to that. It was the various regulatory failings. So I don't know that there's anything that I, as a lawyer, picked up which will have a lot of wisdom. I think probably the Bents and Mr. Bent Sr., who founded the money market fund business, will have a lot of good ideas. And eventually, when these legal matters are over, I'll probably let him speak about them.
Right on. John Dellaportas from Duane Morris, I want to thank you for your time today, sir.
Thank you.
If you'd like to learn more about the cases and issues we just discussed, be sure to go check out our offerings on BloombergLaw.com and also on the Bloomberg Terminal. You can see more of our videos on YouTube, and you can follow our updates on Twitter. I'm Pacchia. Thanks for watching.